but they're still Star Wars fans, and we don't get hung up on what they don't like. We get more hung up on and pulled into, I saw it with my dad. It's been important to me my whole life. Oh, look, I have this collectible, and I never go anywhere without my whatever. And there's always that Star Wars essence that keep people together.
You're listening to Around the Galaxy.
Well, welcome to Around the Galaxy, the Star Wars fan talk show. I am one of your hosts, Pete Fletzer. Normally, there's more than one host. Normally, it's me and my good friend Nick Milky. But tonight, we're doing something just a little bit different for this episode of Around the Galaxy. I'm going to be interviewed by somebody very special because I'm not sure if you've heard or not. If I haven't said it enough, I had a new book that came out this past week on November 11th. It hit on Amazon and it hit on Kindle, and it's available in hardcover and will be paperback on Amazon. But you get paperback now on the whoownsthemyth.com website. Look at that, I'm already plugging. But the book came out last week and it's called Who Owns the Myth? And it's part memoir, part academic study, part mythic study, but really it's kind of a love letter to and some insight into the fandom and why we care so much about Star Wars and why what it is that drives that, the mythology, the fandom, and the personal place that Star Wars tends to hold in all of our hearts. And it was a real sort of labor of love for me, and I'm really excited that the book finally hit and it's finally available. And I hope if you haven't picked up a copy, I hope you get an opportunity to do so. You can check it out. And I'm just excited to talk to you about it tonight because I will be the guest. And as the guest, I will be interviewed not by Nick, but by the gentleman that I dedicated the book to, along with my son, and that would be my father. And so he will be joining us in just a minute. He was also one of the first people to take a look at the book. He provided me many notes and conversation and helped me kind of think about things differently. And he's also been a friend of the show, and he's been on the show multiple times before. And I know from a lot of people, you love getting his insight and his perspective. So I'm excited to bring that to you from him. And also really important to note, I have no idea what he's going to ask me or talk to me about. So this could go anywhere at this point. So if you're hanging out with us, either live watching us record this tonight on a Sunday evening, or you're picking this up on the podcast, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to check out all the stuff about Around the Galaxy on the sswnetwork.com. You can get links to everything from the book to our merch to our Patreon program to older episodes, and check out other people we've had an opportunity to talk to. But before I keep rambling too much, I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and when we come back, it's going to be myself and my father talking about my brand new book called Who Owns the Myth. So we'll be right back in just a minute with more Around the Galaxy. Well, welcome back to Around the Galaxy. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm joined by my dad, Randy. Dad, thank you for doing this. It's kind of funny. I think a lot of people, when they tell their Star Wars story, it always seems to involve family and involve, the story is often, my dad took me, my mom took me, I went with my brother, I took my uncle, my cousin. So it's always very much family. And I try to pick that up in the book. And so I'm really excited to have you taking the lead and leading a conversation about the book with me tonight. This is a lot of fun.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I really feel honored that you asked me to join you tonight at the launch of your book. Congratulations, by the way. Having read it several times, right. It's a great book.
You're as happy as I am that it's out, and we're not talking about I'm getting it ready now.
Well, I'm saying this very objectively. It's a book that the casual Star Wars fan, which I consider myself to be, can read it and enjoy it and associate with it. And some of the anecdotes that you include in the book, I can understand several of my friends looking at them and saying, hey, wait, that happened to me too, or something very close to it happened to me too.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that's where the book will have a universal appeal, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I was on another podcast during the week of the launch, and one of the things that they said was, the thing that I enjoyed the most was the personal stories. And to me, like, that's the thing. This book I will be happy and proud of this book if one person reads something and goes, yeah, that was me, and it brings back a memory that maybe they didn't have, they hadn't thought about in a while. So yeah, thank you.
I can see that happening a lot. In fact, there are 7. I counted. Got prepared for the show. There are 7 interludes, as you call them.
Yep.
And they are the personal stories. And the book seems to, as you said, the book is divided into, and not really divided, it's blended into 3 different sections. It's blended into the history of the franchise,
mm-hmm.
the fandom reaction to the events that happened during the franchise,
mm-hmm.
and then there are the personal observations.
Mm.
Personal anecdotes.
Yeah. But they are sort of broken up into sections as a result, right? I think the first part, and it's kind of even reflected in some of the cover art, it's about the creation of the myth and the impact of it. And then, one of the questions that I had in mind as I was sort of developing this book was something that I hadn't really thought of before until I started putting it together, and it became kind of an important sort of focal point of the story that ends up in here is this concept of, what happens when the creator of a myth walks away from the story and it goes into the hands of the fans and the community that loves it. And then he comes back, and that's really what George did. So that second part is that reaction to that. And, of course, also the sale to Disney and the corporatification, I don't know, whatever that would be. Of the myth, right? The story. And then that third part really is about, okay, so what's the future look like, and will the myth continue to grow? So, but you're right. It does sort of blend in that way. And I think that it's one of the interesting things that I learned about in this situation was that even the story of the Star Wars fandom sort of follows some of the mythical tropes and beats. So it was interesting to me.
Well, the first question I wanted to ask you had to do with the title of the book, Who Owns the Myth?
Yeah.
And with the recent rejection of the script, The Hunt for Ben Solo, wouldn't that mean that Bob Iger owns the myth?
Well, he owns the IP, that's for sure. And thanks for starting right off with the Ben Solo stuff to really get people in that right mindset. No, I agree. And it's a very interesting concept, and it's an interesting thing. But I would say that, the question being, does that mean that Iger owns Smith? And I think that that's one of the underlying questions of the entire book, is the fact that, so once it's out there, is it bigger than the people who own the IP or the people that own the copyright? And I mean, if you go back to even, one of the things that when I came back to the fandom in the 90s and I built the Echo Base website, that was sort of the beginning of fan films. I remember the Troops video, fan film. I remember somebody sent it to me, which was, a takeoff on the Cops TV show. And it's really hilarious. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to go find the video called Troops. It's still out there on YouTube. Hilarious. But it was an interesting time because Lucasfilm was also recognizing that fans were making their own films, and it was because they even for a while there they had, I don't know how many of you remember this, but they had the Star Wars Fan Film Awards. They did that for a couple of years, which was really interesting and really cool. But to address your question directly, he owns the IP, but I think the reaction from a lot of people, and yes, there's certain people that love the sequels and want to see more of those characters. That's a percentage of the fandom, and a percentage that doesn't care. And I think that that's an interesting observation in itself. But the people that hear about it and want it, I think they own the myth almost as much, if not more, from a philosophical perspective than Bob Iger and the Mouse, because it's the reaction to hearing that there's more Ben Solo's story that may be out there that was ready to come out that Bob Iger said no to. I mean, that's almost the reaction is similar to when the special editions came out and George made some changes. So I think it's I think it's an illustration of what happens when a corporate entity owns the myth and the response from the fans. So I didn't really answer your question in that indirectly, but I do think that to me, it reinforced that the myth is owned by the fandom more so than the lawyers and the corporate IP people at Disney. Hey, this is Pete Fletzer. If you're enjoying this conversation and want to explore the ideas a little deeper, my new book, Who Owns the Myth, is out now. You can grab a signed copy and exclusive bundles at whoownsthemyth.com. And if you use the code MYTHPOD, MYTHPOD, you're going to save 25% on the order when you check out. And of course, it's also available on Amazon in Kindle and hard copy. Thank you so much for supporting the myth, and may the force be with you.
I think it's an interesting relationship between the ownership of what did you call it? The IP?
Yeah, the intellectual property. Yep.
Intellectual property. Yeah, the ownership and the fandom that really supports the ownership financially, because if the owners don't do right by the fans, eventually, sooner or later, that ownership will have no value.
Right.
It can go right down to zero. So, in that respect, the fandom does have a certain amount of control.
Right.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would. And I would also say that at this point, there's a very interesting sort of dichotomy, because the fandom, when the prequels came out, there was a split in the fandom, and when the sequels came out, there was an even larger split in the fandom. And so the question now is, what's financially positive for Disney to focus on? Right, with the sort of response to the sequels, right, which has been in a way kind of it's been the biggest noise in social media, and probably not the least reason being that the fact that this is the generation of social media that now is taking over the myth. But that's been where the biggest fight has been. But I always go back to the first line of The Force Awakens, when Max von Sydow, Laura Santeca, says, "This will begin to set things right." And to me, that felt like it was Disney saying, "We heard you didn't like the prequels. We heard what you've been saying, but we are going to bring back the story you want." And oddly enough, that worked for a percentage of the audience, and a percentage of the audience didn't love it. So I guess, that's a great question, because the challenge is, how much do you bend to what a portion of the fandom wants? And how do you know which is right? And I think that's a bigger question, because I don't know you look at where the noise is in social media and on YouTube and whatnot, and you could say there's a lot of anti-Disney noise, but there's also a lot of people that absolutely love that, the Disney era, myself being one, because I look at it as an expansion of where we are in the myth. But where is the money? And I think, as I'm saying this out loud, I think the answer is coming out in May of 2026 with the Mandalorian and Grogu movie. And to me, that is Disney taking the safest possible route to go back into movie theaters, right? I don't know anybody who doesn't love the Mandalorian and Grogu who's watched it, right? They may not love season 3, but that's a whole other conversation. But Mandalorian and Grogu is the safest bet. I always say you can't throw a cat in a Walmart without hitting a Grogu t-shirt. They're still out there. So I think by throwing Mando and Grogu back in the theater, it almost feels too safe to me. But it addresses your question directly, and that's where they're going, right? So
it does. On another note, just to change the subject a little bit, when I was reading the book,
right.
I noticed that the introduction was done by, or the foreword was done by Scott Chernoff.
Yeah.
Why did you ask Scott Chernoff to do it? No offense to Scott.
Yeah, right. No, Scott's actually become, it's funny. We have this sort of Nick's wife actually spawned the phrase "weird space friends," which is sort of the Star Wars friends that we've made, right? People who we've known along the way. And Scott actually, as much as Steve Sansweet gave me my entry into Star Wars Galaxy magazine, Steve introduced me to Scott, and Scott gave me some opportunity with Star Wars Insider. So that felt like a nice payoff. But in addition to that, Scott has been a great friend of the Around the Galaxy show. He's been on a number of times, and he's just, he was the editor of Star Wars Insider when I was a part of it. And so there was that sort of direct connection, but he's also just very insightful, a very funny guy. He's a comedy writer. He does some of the voices on BoJack Horseman, or writing on BoJack Horseman. He's a voice on Rick and Morty, and every time he's been on Around the Galaxy, he has raised questions. I mean, it's funny. I went back and, of course, listened to some of my interviews with him as we were having the conversation, and there were plenty of times where I found myself saying, "I didn't think of it that way." And in typical Scott Chernoff fashion, he would say, "Well, now you will." And so it was. He just has a really unique insight to Star Wars, and he and I are we came to realize that we're on a very similar page as far as we both kind of recognize that the reason Star Wars fans are the way they are is because we love it. And we also agree that there's no room for the toxicity in Star Wars fandom or football fandom or, whatever you're a fan of. Leave the isms out, leave the politics out, and let's talk about the story. And so he and I, we're absolutely on the same page on that. And I was really very honored that he said he would go and do it for me. So, and I think it's a great forward, and I think it sets up the book really, really well.
Now, here's the question I probably should have asked first. Where did the idea for this book come from? I remember getting a text from you saying, Dad, would you look through this book for me? I wrote it, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know you were writing one. So where did the idea come from? And what caused you to start it?
What caused me to start? Well, why would you do this to yourself?
I've got an idea for about a half dozen books, and none of them are started. So, so props to you for that.
Well, I've always wanted to. Well, I mean, just because you got me kind of started writing with the Amazing Science Fiction Horror Trivia Game, writing columns for your newsletter that went out for that. And so from that point on, I felt like, and I think actually around that time too, I was a big Stephen King fan. And so in my head, I wanted to write a Stephen King style book. And every time I started it, I got about, 50 pages in and was like, this is awful. And so I would just stop it. But I always kind of knew or felt like I wanted to write a book. I felt like I had a book in me. I didn't know what it was. And then through the podcast, I started to realize, okay, maybe there's something here from the podcast that I could turn into a book. And before I even started this, so I started this about a year ago. But before I started that, I actually started writing a book about some of the stories that I heard from my guests. Why don't I take this great story that I heard about where, from, author here and fan there and put it, and then I started writing it. And I started thinking, you know what, this isn't my story to tell. That's their story to tell. And it was great to have them tell it on my podcast, but it didn't feel like that was, that's their personal story. And the second thing, quite honestly, as I said at the beginning of this show, it was kind of the same story over and over. Everybody, came into Star Wars in a very similar way, and there was always a familial kind of connection. So, but I like that part of it. But then, I've done a bunch of sort of online essays and video essays and things like that. And I started sort of writing this, and it was almost started out as sort of a collection of essays. And that's why I think the style of the book is very much like you're reading or hearing a podcast. It's that kind, because that's just the way I write, and that's kind of the way I've become accustomed to writing. And I started really digging into some of the concepts of what I found that I was in a unique position to do was the fact that I have been a fan on the front lines, literally from when I was 7 years old to today, and seeing the way fandom has changed. And even, some of my best friends, like Mike, my best friend since I was third grade, he's not a big fan of the sequels. And that's okay, because I still know that Star Wars is still critically important to him. I remember talking to my buddy Jay, and he was like, I really still don't like the prequels. I can't get over the prequels. And I was like, well, that's okay. He's like, but you don't understand how important Star Wars is to me. I still have all my Star Wars toys from when I was a kid. And so when I started thinking about that, I was trying to figure out why that is, and tying it to some of the sort of ugliness and sort of the debates and the headbutting that I've seen online recently, and tried to connect where that is. And it all came back to Joseph Campbell. And the thing that, when I heard Joseph Campbell talking about why myths matter to us, because it's something that's deeper than we even really fathom and understand. There's this sort of built-in story that we've heard for as long as humanity's been around. That's what really drove, or more importantly, to the reason, the sort of essence of this book is, that's what I wanted to dig into. And I wanted to see, I knew it worked for the Luke Skywalker story in A New Hope, and I knew it worked for the original trilogy. And then I started to wonder, is that what's still working on people today? And it was worth just sort of proposing it as a question. And it's funny, a friend of mine, Cam, he's a guy online who I've become friendly with. He ordered a book, and I signed it, to him as "You Own the Myth." And so he wrote me back. He said, well, you should have put a spoiler alert on there, because now I know I don't need to read the book. But Cam Ray is his name. He's a funny guy. I really do believe that the myth is owned by everybody who's ever been affected by it, and who's seen it and carried it with them in their heads and their hearts. And that can be a corporate vice president of marketing at Disney. I mean, that's, they may be affected by it. They own the myth as much as I do, or Jack, my son, who is your grandson, who's just like, his Star Wars is completely different than my Star Wars, but we're both in the same world. And I think that's kind of cool. So who owns the myth is, it's such a broad question, and honestly such a vague answer. And I think that's the objective of the book, is to have somebody come out of it and go, oh, okay, yeah, I haven't thought of that way, or maybe I did think of it that way. I'm glad to see somebody else thinks of it the same.
The internet.
Yes.
major influence in probably perpetuating the enthusiasm of Star Wars fans, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, and I think it's also responsible for some of the biggest rifts in the fandom as well.
How different do you think Star Wars fandom would be if the internet had waited 20 years to come along?
Wow. It's a very interesting question. I think the difference would be is, I don't think there would be the backlash that we see against Disney. I think, because think about it, if you go back 20 years to when the prequels came out, the internet was burgeoning, and there were certainly conversations happening, but there weren't tribes forming yet like there are now. But I think the response to everything would, whether it's Disney, whether it's a specific movie, a specific plot point, something that's changed, something in the lore that's been modified, perhaps. I think the difference would be that you'd have to have those conversations in person, right? Like I remember people talking about Ewoks, right? And just like, that's, this is George making it for kids. He's looking for something to sell. And as a kid, it didn't bother me. If that happened, if the internet existed in 1983, people would have said George has lost his way. And it would have been a whole faction of people who would have bought into that concept. Because I think the problem with the internet today is that there's money to be made in being negative and finding problems with things. And so something as simple as the Ewoks would have become a reason why Star Wars is a failure now, right? And it would have become a talking point, and it would have been a side that you're on. Either you're pro Ewok or you're pro Star Wars, or whatever. There would be like these big big giant conversations that are similar to today. I think if the internet wasn't around during the sequel trilogy, I think it might have been more readily accepted as part of the bigger Star Wars story, because it would be more difficult to, I've having worked in the internet and for most of my adult life in one form or another, I always hoped and prayed that the internet would help make people brighter. It would help make people look for more information, instead of what happened is, whether it's politics or sports or Star Wars, it's helped people just find people who feed whatever they want to hear. And so if I didn't like the sequels, it's so easy for me to find somebody who can tell me why I'm right. And it's the same, honestly, for people who love this stuff. And there's Star Wars shows like the Acolyte is a great example of a show that divided the fandom even before it came out, that people were deliberately looking for a reason to blow it up and dislike it so they could drive clicks and make money on their YouTube channels. But if you did that without the internet, that would have to happen in person. And yeah, I mean, us nerds, we don't mind having a good heated argument in person, but I'm also not going to call you names in person. I'm going to have a conversation, and hopefully we'll walk away with agree to disagree. And nobody agrees to disagree online. And I think that's the biggest problem. So,
right.
Yeah.
When I was thinking of questions to ask, I was trying to think of things that there a lot of questions I knew the answers to, but there were a few questions that I don't know the answers to. And one of them is, I always considered the time from, say, about 1984 to when the say 1997.
Yep,
as the dark ages of Star Wars.
Yeah.
What were you doing as a huge Star Wars fan, about to be a Star Wars insider?
Yeah.
What were you doing during those times?
It's funny because I used to think, and it's funny how you kind of, your own personal story kind of changes until you really start to think about it. I thought that I had kind of walked away during the dark times, that I wasn't as actively involved. But then I've been talking to people, and as I'm thinking about this book, and as I was writing pieces of this book, I realized that I read a lot of those Star Wars books. And it's funny, Chris Ryans would be laughing at me right now because I don't read any of the new ones. But I read, Heir to the Empire, the Thrawn trilogy, and a lot of the books that had come out at the time, and I didn't love them, to be honest with you. They felt more science fiction to me than science fantasy. It felt like it wasn't exactly written in the Star Wars style, but I was still connected there. I was still actively involved in collecting, not as much, but when things came out, I was there. And I was still always a Star Wars fan. And, I think about, one of the one of my first real jobs. I remember even like having Star Wars toys on my desk, and people like, oh yeah, my son loves Star Trek. And I'm like, well, this isn't Star Trek, but I'm not going to nerd out on you right here, right now. But in hindsight, and this was one of the things that made me feel like, yeah, there's a story that I can tell here. Is that, yeah, I during the dark times, as we all call them, a lot of us call it that, there was still a lot going on, and it was just in different ways. It wasn't, I think it was almost like a weird sort of keeper of the flame kind of fandom in that time, right? There was the Star Wars role-playing game from West End Games. There was the comic book series for the Heir to the Empire, the Dark Empire, stories. And
now let me ask you, who did you play the role-playing games with?
That was the weird thing. I didn't play them with anybody. But the funny thing is, and this actually I've been doing research and preparing for this book, realizing that while it wasn't a super popular role-playing game, because West End Games literally kind of went out of business overnight one day, there was a lot of the things that surrounded the West End Games uh, game and the supporting materials were becoming sort of Star Wars lore. It was writing the lore. In fact, there were times where Lucasfilm would tell writers, "Hey, there's this really interesting planet in the West End Games book, whatever," and they it was starting to become where the lore was. So I think not just myself not playing it a lot, if at all, but there were so many. There was the Star Wars Adventure Journal, which came out with West End Games, which was a quarterly book of short stories that also came with information about, the ship that was mentioned there. If you want to use it in your game, this character, if you want to use it in your game, here's the stats and things you need to know. And funny story, I was writing, I don't know if you remember, I was writing a story for West End Games, the Star Wars Adventure Journal. And I was working with their editors, and I had gotten the final edit back, and literally West End Games went out of business before my story went out. So I would have been in the next Star Wars event, which means that I probably would have had something that might have been canon having been written, but it just was bad timing. But to answer your question, I think, what I was doing was I was sort of quietly keeping up with it. I think the Star Wars pride, if you will, wasn't as prominent at that time because we didn't know if it was ever coming back. It was more of a personal memory than a pop culture presence that it is now.
And yet the myth was established. Whether you knew it was going to come back and continue, it was already there and it was going to be there.
Right. Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the thing about the books at that time. And I think that's why people reacted the way they did when Disney decided that those stories were no longer considered canon to the ongoing Star Wars story. There were so many stories out there. And again, one of the things that I bring up in the book is people are also, because of things like West End Games, the role-playing game, or just being a fan, were creating the stories in their own heads about what we didn't see. Because remember, at that time, it was just 3 movies. I remember vividly you and I sort of trying to figure out what we thought the Clone Wars was. I mean, that was brilliant of George to just put it out there as part of the first movie and a bit of history, that we didn't know about. And I always say if they had done Star Wars in 2020, Luke Skywalker would have said, no, my father didn't fight in the Clone Wars. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi would have told him the story, and it would have been a 10-minute flashback of, the Clone Wars, and that mystery wouldn't have existed. But I think because the mystery existed, and also I think the other big thing that people often forget about, or not, I don't know if they forget about it, but don't give enough credit to, is the Star Wars toys. We were making up our own stories. We had our own backstory to Walrus Man before he was called Ponda Baba. We had our own stories about where Chewbacca came from. We had our own stories because we were making them up as kids. And I remember, debating them with Mike and Matt in the neighborhood about, well, no, the X-Wing probably came from blah, 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 or wherever, because that information wasn't there. And I honestly am still not sure. And I think this is why I don't necessarily read a lot of the comic books. I'm still not sure if having those stories is a good thing or not, right? I mean, you can get to, I have the Star Wars encyclopedias and things like that. I can get the backstory on just about anybody who's ever been on screen in Star Wars. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. Like, leave that stuff open. And that's why I think Disney is able to create stories today, because I think it's sort of filling out the top layer of the story versus the core of the story. Hey, this is Pete Fletzer. If what you're hearing today is resonating with you, I'd love for you to check out my new book, Who Owns the Myth? Head over to whoownsthemyth.com for signed editions and special bundles, and use the code MYTHPOD, MYTHPOD, for 25% off your order. Or, if it's easier, feel free to pick it up in the Kindle or hard copy edition right over on Amazon. I hope you'll join me on this mythic journey. Now, let me ask you a question. As somebody who's not a deep nerd, like myself, like Nick, right, like Chris, like Kelsey.
Or a normie, as you would call them.
A normie, as we call them, yes. How did this book strike you? Do you feel like you knew, did you feel like you had to know more than you did to be able to get into the book? Or do you feel like it spoke to a broad enough general audience?
Oh, no. Well, first of all, let's eliminate all the interludes, because I was personally involved in just about all of them. So,
right. Yeah.
and I loved everyone because it's all about me.
Yes, this is true. This is true. That's why I dedicated the book to you, so you would just know this is all about you.
There's no question, right? I thought as a normie, it was tough for me to put the book down, excluding the interludes. I loved it. It was like a thumbnail history of the Star Wars franchise. And along with the thumbnail history, how it affected the fans of the franchise and why the fans reacted as they did. And the thing that I learned about it, about the fan reaction, was the fact that it depended on the age of the fan, the generation of the fan, as to where they jumped into the Star Wars saga. And in most cases, the point at which they jumped into the saga was what meant the most to them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, it kept each era of Star Wars alive, because of each generation that jumped in at different points. I think from a personal point of view, I knew nothing and still know nothing about the Clone Wars.
Right.
So it means nothing to me.
Right. Right.
However, my grandson knows all about the Clone Wars.
Right.
And that's his, I don't know if it's his jumping in point, because I know he saw the original movies on television when he was very, very young. But the Clone Wars seemed to mean quite a bit to him. Yeah. How am I doing?
Yeah, that's great.
Am I right about that?
No, I think you're 100% right. And actually, it's good to hear that, because I think that was one thing that I was super conscious about as I was writing the book. Was I didn't want it to be, one of the things I say all the time on ATG Live is, like, I hate things that you need to have done homework for. Like, so for example, when people, one of the things in The Rise of Skywalker, they talk about the whole, I don't know, you probably saw the movie once. Have you seen The Rise of Skywalker?
Yes.
The last one? Okay.
Yep.
To me,
I've seen all 9.
Okay, to me, it was infinitely forgettable as a film, and I don't mean that. I know, but the thing is, I know a lot of people love it, and that's great. But and one of the things that one of my complaints about it is, like, I don't know, like, the whole searching for the knife and the connection to Luke and Lando and that whole thing, and Ochi of Bastoon, who they mention as a character who apparently was super important, but we don't know anything about. People tell me that Adam Christopher wrote his book, which makes all that connection, which is great. But I didn't read that book, so to me, that connection still doesn't exist. And so one of the things
you'll find this interesting. That may be the only movie that I enjoyed more than you.
There you go. Cool.
And I'll tell you why.
Yes,
I loved the ending. I loved the way they ended.
Awesome.
It was predictable, but I still enjoyed it.
See, and that's one of the funny things. I remember when I went to go see, I saw that movie with Joe and Mike, and doubt it was Zig, but it might have been Zig. But anyways, my friend group that you know, went to high school with them and everything. I remember when I walked out of it the first time I saw it, I was disappointed. When they walked out, they were like, "That was the best of the sequels." And to me, I think the reason it's because you don't have to be a deep Star Wars nerd. You don't question how the Emperor came back. You just know him as the Thanos of the Star Wars saga, and the bad guy is back, and holy cow, they got to take him down. And there's a lot of action, and Luke Skywalker was back, and he was like the cool Force ghost, and he did his Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like, it hit all those buttons. And for me, I felt like there was such opportunity in it that they missed, but that's probably because of where I sit as a fan. And so it's interesting to hear that you loved it, and that is your favorite one of the sequels, probably, or is it?
It is, and it's not. I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say I loved it. I loved Star Wars. I loved Empire Strikes Back.
Right.
I liked Return of the Jedi very, very, very much.
Right. But it's interesting because that's, again, that's where this corporate ownership comes in. If they can get, what I have to remind my deep fan friends of is we're on the edges of the bell curve, right? We make up, let's say 10% of the fandom, maybe 15%, maybe even let's go as far as a quarter. But you still have 75 to 90% of the fandom that goes to Disney World, that buys the t-shirts, that subscribe to Disney Plus, that need to buy the movie tickets that they need to appease and reach, which again is why I'm firmly convinced that the Mando and Grogu movie is why they went that way, because they know that even people who've never watched the show know who Grogu is, and they know who the Mandalorian is, or at least know enough about them to want to go see that movie. And so where I always come down on that, though, is I'm happy they're doing it, because if they can keep the myth alive, if Disney can keep it going, if they can introduce Jack to it, and then the kids who are younger than Jack, and keep them going, then we're going to have Star Wars for the next 50 years. If Absolutely. They can keep that connected. You say it all the time. If it doesn't appeal to a 12-year-old, and like it or not, that's what George said. And that's why myths work, because they speak it simply enough to understand it. That's what will keep Star Wars alive. That'll keep the myth alive. And so I'm all for I hope Starfighter, when that comes out, I hope that's just a fun movie with Ryan Gosling and Mia Goth. I hope it's just a fun movie that takes place in the Star Wars universe that pulls people back in. And if a mythology builds off of that, that's great too. But keep making movies for that 75%, keep making shows for that 75%, and us nerds will find what we need to find in that. But just keep making that.
Getting back to the book, there's a story. One of the interludes in the story is, and has always been, my favorite. The story that I tell my friends when I tell my friends about my son, the Star Wars insider fan, whatever. It's the story of your interview with Ben Burt.
Yeah.
Tell that story now. I love hearing you tell it.
Yeah. So this will be slightly expanded from what's in the book, because I wanted to keep it short. So one of the things at the time, I had the first Star Wars website. I'm pretty convinced it was the first one, if not the first, one of the first ones. And there was there was this movie that Ben Burt was creating in IMAX with a bunch of other people at Lucasfilm called Special Effects. And one of the cool things about it was that it was Ben Burt was recreating the opening shot of A New Hope in IMAX, which just to see that on an IMAX screen was incredible. And I guess we're going to get to see it again in 2027 when they re-release the 50th anniversary. It's going to be in IMAX, which is cool. Nice. So it was going to premiere at the Liberty Science Center in New Jersey. And since I had one of the rare Star Wars websites, Liberty Science Center reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you mind promoting this movie that's going to premiere and be exclusive to our IMAX theater?" And I said, "Yeah, but I'll make you a deal. I want to go to the premiere." And because I knew, being the Star Wars nerd that I was, that it was like the big premiere was going to be there and they were going to have the party and all that stuff. And they said, "Okay, but what we need from you is to run some sort of promotion on the site." And I said, "What if I created a coupon for like $2 off your ticket to the IMAX movie?" And they said, "Yeah, sure."
How old were you at the time?
How old was I at the time? I was like 26, I think, 25, 26 years old, working in digital marketing. And so people had to print off this coupon on their dot matrix printer, right? And it was there on the site. And so they sent me my ticket. At that time, also, I was being asked, so this is also tied to the Steve Sansweet story, in that I was also being asked from fans all over where Steve Sansweet was going to be doing his special edition presentation around the country. As you recall, because you were taking your game to the same conventions that Steve was at.
By the way, I think I had already seen it.
Yeah, you probably did. Because you were going to more conventions than I was.
Yeah, we were selling the game at they were mostly Star Trek conventions,
Yeah,
which is the ironic thing about
it. Right. So people were reaching out to me saying, "Where's Steve going to be?" And I had no idea because I wasn't an official site. So I decided I was going to call Lucasfilm, and I was going to just see if I could get a copy of Steve's schedule so I could put it up on the website. And so I called Lucasfilm, as you do. And, back in 1995, 96, they still had a receptionist that picked up the phone. And she picked it up and I said, "Hi, I have a website and I would love to get Steve Sansweet's itinerary. Which cities is he going to be in to present his special edition presentation at?" And they said, "Okay, hang on a second." They put me on hold, and I'm sitting there and I still can see it. I was literally like laying on the floor with the phone, right? And just like I don't know. I was 25. I don't know. And I'm looking across the room, and on my bookshelf is like 4 or 5 Steve Sansweet books. I was a fan of everything he'd written. I was big into collectibles at the time. And I expected, though, they were going to be like, "Okay, well, we'll send it to you, what email address or whatever." They put me through, and on the other line, I hear Steve Sansweet speaking, and I was floored. I mean, literally, I guess, right? I was shocked that I was speaking to Steve, who, you recall, we also saw him like regularly on QVC doing his Star Wars pitches there.
Right.
And we just started talking, and he was interested in the website because Lucasfilm didn't have a website yet. There was no StarWars.com. And I was interested in where he was going to be. And the conversation kind of turned. He was asking me about the website. And I said, "Well, originally I wanted to just kind of use it to promote some of my writing." And he said, "Oh, you're a writer. Well, that's interesting." He said, "I have more work at Star Wars Galaxy magazine than I can possibly keep up with. Would you be interested in maybe taking on an assignment or two?" And of course, I jumped to it and said yes. And I said, "As a matter of fact, I'm going to the premiere of Special Effects in Jersey City in a couple weeks." He said, "Great. Write me," I think it was 125 words, a very short story. Go to that. Talk to Ben Burt if you can, and then write it and submit it." And so I was like, "Holy cow, that's great!" And he said, "Send me your package." So I sent it FedEx overnight to him. So I go to this premiere in Jersey City at the IMAX theater, and because I had credentials, I got to the after party, and Ben Burt, as you know, but a lot of people may not know, I'm like many Star Wars fans. I was a huge fan of the special effects and the sound design. I just was like, that meant so much to me. And I knew all about Ben Burt. I was one of those fans that could name half the people who were in production on the Star Wars movies. And I remember, and this was great. There's always this fear of meeting your heroes, meeting people that you've sort of always wanted to meet. And Ben Burt was standing there, I'm probably holding a drink in his hand, and I walked up to him and I introduced myself, and I was nervous as hell to even talk to him for a second. And what I noticed about Ben Burt, speaking to him, and I ended up talking to him for about 15, 20 minutes, got a couple quotes. And what I will never forget about Ben Burt was that he almost seemed as shy talking to me as I was talking to him. You could tell he was a special effects guy who worked behind the scenes, very proud of his work, very, very sort of intelligent about the way he spoke about everything. But there was no ego. There was no, "I'm a star, I've created these things." He was just there. And I think in a way he was also kind of just, he was like similar to me, surprised I was signing autographs at this library a couple years later. I think he was just happy that somebody enjoyed what he did, right? And was genuine about it. Not just like, "Oh, he's that guy, let me go talk to him." I mean, he just felt it. And then a couple, I think when the special editions came out, that's when I had an opportunity to interview him again for a full feature in Star Wars Galaxy magazine, and that was really great. And I don't know if he remembered me directly, but he remembered the event, so that was great. But yeah, meeting Ben Burt as a result of getting an assignment from Steve Sansweet that ended up in an official Lucasfilm magazine from somebody who was just a Star Wars fan. The Star Wars fan among everybody who knew me, right? That was me. I was the Star Wars guy. And to suddenly now have that place in Star Wars, as small as it was, just to have my name appear in Star Wars Galaxy magazine that first time was amazing. And meeting and that was done through meeting Ben Bird. It wasn't just like an opinion piece or something. It was through meeting Ben Bird and going to a movie premiere. It was just fantastic, unbelievable.
So I guess technically speaking, that telephone call with you lying on your back on the floor, you were actually making the crossover from Star Wars fan to Star Wars insider at that time and didn't realize it.
Didn't even realize it, right? Yeah, it's funny when I think even today when you do podcasts and there's thousands of Star Wars podcasts, you're always, you always have an opinion. You're a Star Wars person, and I think I'm still to this day, and Nick would probably say the same thing. In fact, I know he would. We're just surprised at not only the people that we know that we're friends with, like the fans, the people who are watching this right now, the people who don't miss an episode, the people who DM us and have become what I would call really friends of the show and what I would consider a friend. Like if I got to see Matt Harrington in person, I would give the man a hug. I've never met him, but he's a weird space friend. But when Nick and I think about some of the people that are also Star Wars fans, and that's why we become friendly with them, like the fact that we are, Nick and I can pick up the phone and call our friends from ESPN that happen to be Star Wars fans, that then we go and see them on TV covering NASCAR or Major League Baseball or NHL hockey. It's so strange. It's so weird. And what we find is that whether you're a Star Wars insider or not, or you're a celebrity who's a fan, or you're my neighbor down the street who's a Star Wars, they're all the same people when you hit that Star Wars note. And I think that's one of the things that's important about this book, or that got me going about this book, was because I've met people who, when I got to interview Charlie Benante from Anthrax, I'm a huge Anthrax fan. I'm going to see them again next year. I'm like a huge Anthrax fan. And I found out that he was a huge Star Wars fan and made that connection. And as I'm talking to him in that interview that I did several years ago, we were just two Star Wars fans. And as soon as I got over the hump of, oh my God, it's the drummer from one of my favorite bands. Once we got over that, we're just Star Wars fans. When we talked to Greg Grunberg, he's been such a supporter of the charity work we've done and things. He's just a Star Wars fan. He happens to have been in the Star Wars in the Star Wars movies, is best friends with J.J. Abrams. But when we're talking, it's just because we're Star Wars fans. And to me, that's this amazing connection that keeps the story alive. And those are the people who own the myth, right? Those are the people who and look, we've talked to many major fans who are, even some authors who are like, yeah, I'm still not a big fan of whatever, but they're still Star Wars fans. And we don't get hung up on what they don't like. We get more hung up on and pulled into, I saw it with my dad. It's been important to me my whole life. Oh, look, I have this collectible and I never go anywhere without my whatever. And there's always that Star Wars essence that keep people together. Hey, this is Pete Fletzer. If this conversation has you thinking more about the mythology of Star Wars, you can dive deeper in my new book, Who Owns the Myth? Signed copies and bundles are at whoownsthemyth.com, and if you use promo code MYTHPOD, MYTHPOD, you're going to get 25% off your order at checkout. And it's also available, of course, on Amazon in both Kindle and hard copy. Wherever you get it, I hope it becomes a part of your story.
I think it's about time you define what you mean by ownership.
It's not the people who own the intellectual property. To me, I mean ownership of the thing that makes you feel like it's yours. And I know that's sort of redefining, just sort of saying what the word own means anyway. But there's something about this myth that people feel so personally connected to, that's why I asked the question of who owns it, because to me, ownership in this case is that deep connection. It's not just the super fans. It's the guy that you meet at a bar and you're hanging out and you're like, oh, you got a Millennium Falcon shirt on. You're a Star Wars fan? Oh, yeah. And then you get his side. And sometimes it's, yeah, but I really didn't get into the sequels. And that's okay. Let's have a conversation. Let's keep this one going. So ownership to me is how it affected you. And if it affected you enough to sort of fly that flag in one way or another. And I think people don't realize, like I was watching, one of my favorite people on YouTube is a guy named Ryan George. And he's like a comedian. He does these really funny pitch meetings for movies and things. And he's kind of like he's a Canadian comedian, I guess. But the other day I saw him doing one of his shows and he had a Stormtrooper shirt on. And I was like, that's my connection. That's how I'm going to get Ryan George on the show. Because if you're just wearing a Stormtrooper shirt, you're at least saying Star Wars is cool enough for me to wear it on my shirt, which is all you need to be somebody who has an affinity or an affection for the story. And that makes him an owner of the myth, right? Even if he's only seen the movies twice and he's just a casual fan, he's fan enough that it affected him enough to see that shirt on a shelf and go, that's cool. I'm going to wear that.
He's proud enough to tell the world, and that's what he's doing.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Now, as we get closer to the end of the interview, as the author of the book, what do you want people to take away from the book after they've read it?
Honestly, I think there's two things that I think would make me very proud of this book is if, one, somebody reads it and relives a memory of their own, which probably is not directly related to my memory, but something where they go, oh, yes, I remember that. Like somebody was telling me that the Sandpile Galaxy interlude, they just were like, yeah, we used to play with our figures. And it probably wasn't in a sandpile, and it was probably a very different situation, but he remembered playing with his action figures as a kid. And Chris Ryans said it on our show recently about the book. He said he thinks it's great because now maybe some newer fans might get a new understanding of what it's been like to be a fan from the beginning, which, is just a different way to look at something you love. The second thing I'd like people to get out of it is a better understanding, or understanding might be the wrong word, sort of a consciousness about why people fight about it. And again, I am discounting 100% the people who are fighting about it because of politics, because of their own personal, not even personal, but anything that's not related to the story. But there are people who don't like the sequels, not because it's Disney, not because of that it represents the characters in a more modern way, but because they didn't like something about it. And I want people to maybe have those conversations with people and understand that it doesn't speak to them the way the prequels didn't speak to me the first time I saw them, because it wasn't what I believe. There's that ownership. It wasn't my Star Wars. And to understand that that's what's fueling the passion behind it. That's what's fueling the reaction and the response to it. Again, as long as it's not done in a hateful or spiteful way, if it's a valid conversation, you and I know Bill Pricestock, who wrote one of the comments in my book. Bill is not over the prequels. He still can't get by the prequels. He still tells me he doesn't, but he's a Star Wars fan.
He's passionate about it.
Right.
And that's the important thing. Doesn't matter what side of the fence he's on, as long as he's passionate about it. Right. As you said earlier in this interview, it's because he cares. He really cares. Yep. And he feels like Star Wars is something that, as the title of the book says, belongs to him.
Yeah. Yep. 100%. And so to me, if you walk away from this with at least giving a little more grace to people who don't like something that you do like about Star Wars, then that to me is a win as well.
Wow, this is amazing. I've learned things about your growing up that I wasn't aware of. Not too many, but
well, this was great. This was very cool. I really appreciate taking the time, and we'll have to do this again. So
absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Well, everybody who's hanging out, thank you so much. Make sure to like, subscribe, share, all that stuff you're supposed to do. Check out the sswnetwork.com. And if you want the book, head on over to whoownsthemyth.com. You can pick it up there. There's links to the places to get it at Amazon, but you can also get the signed and swag pack versions at whoownsthemyth.com. Or you can just go there, find your link, and get it from Amazon as well. It's available on Kindle. It's hardcover, paperback through whoownsthemyth.com, and paperback coming out very soon. I can't wait till I can tell you guys about that.
You will not be disappointed.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks. We will be signing off.
And as Nick Milky might say, may the force be with you.
Always. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Around the Galaxy. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed it, please make sure to like, subscribe, share, rate, and review it wherever you do that stuff with podcasts. Also, head on over to the sswnetwork.com for more information, previous shows, and links to all the stuff that you need to know as a Around the Galaxy fan. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Copyright 2025 Pete in the Seat Studios, and our music is brought to us by the band Apollo's Ghost, available on Spotify or wherever you find your music.